Hey guys, so now that the season is over, it is time to do my player ranking for Australian Survivor Heroes vs. Villains, where I rank every player based on the games that they played during the season. And this was a mostly difficult list to put together. I feel like there are some pretty tough calls to make, although there are plenty of other calls that were relatively easy to make. But there are 24 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 24, the player I believe played the worst game on this season is Rogue. And I think Rogue will go down as being one of the worst players in Australian Survivor, if not even all of Survivor, where it is historic just how bad of a game she played here, where from day one, she never seemed to have any allies on her side and was pretty much a pariah on her tribe, where we get scene after scene of her annoying her tribe members and not bonding with them really at all. Like, I think the whole conversation with Nina alone highlights just how bad she is socially and also how problematic she can be given her comments there. But she never had anyone on her side, and while she was the fourth boot of the season, that was mainly because her tribe won the first year immunity challenges. And literally by that fourth round, the tribe just had enough and they literally threw the challenge just to get rid of her. And even worse was that Haley was the one to throw the challenge. You know, this player that was very concerned about her threat level as a former winner. You know, like knowing that no former winner before had ever survived a single tribal on their return. The fact that she willingly allowed her tribe to go to tribal just to get rid of Rogue, again, highlights just how bad she was socially. And even in her short time she interacted with the villains during the challenges, she managed to get it on their nerves as well, to where they're literally applauding the heroes after they see that Rogue had been voted out. So it's just really insane how bad and annoying Rogue was throughout the season. And she herself didn't really understand the game at all, to where she kept harping on the fact that the heroes weren't really heroes and that she saw herself as the only true hero on the tribe, which again highlights her lack of self awareness. And when they go to tribal, she asks to be voted out because she doesn't want to play with these quote unquote heroes. And while it technically is not a unanimous vote because they decided to split the vote in case there's an idol, she really had no one on her side at any point. And I feel like Rogue will go down as being one of the worst players in all of Survivor. And she played such an actively bad game that I feel like 24 is the right spot for her. Now we're moving on to number 23, and I think these next couple of players can go either way, and I'm sure there'll be some disagreement with my decision here. However, I did decide to go with Michael. Now, Michael's a bit strange because he did technically survive a tribal, unlike some people will be talking about in a moment. However, I feel like Michael also had fewer connections in the game, where he did try to turn the vote against George at the very beginning by getting Simon and Liz on board. However, it was just never going to happen, and he was voted out pretty decisively at his second tribal. So I feel like in general, Michael has less pros going for him outside surviving that first tribal, and I'm sure some people feel like he's a bit too low here. However, I feel like he did a bit more wrong to get himself on the target list, and I feel like in general, he had fewer people on his side throughout the game, which was enough to land him here at number 23. Now moving on to number 22, and this one's a bit more debatable compared to Michael, but I have my rationale. But here we have Jackie, the first boot of the season, and I really feel bad for Jackie. You can clearly tell that she's a super fan, that she wanted another chance, and she's taken out in the first challenge mainly due to incompetence on the production team. Like, they should have known that that challenge wasn't safe, but obviously she gets taken out, and obviously through that we don't know as much about her game. She wasn't really on the show. Now, we did hear after the fact that she probably would have been the first boot over Anjali had they gone to that first tribal, which is a pretty big knock against her, and I did consider putting her at number 23 because of that. However, the main reason I have her above Michael is she at least had more allies within the game, where she was in that alliance with George and Anjali in that first round. Whereas I feel like Michael didn't really have anyone, even though he does technically survive that vote. That's more so of a consensus vote than him actually being in a good position. So I did debate that to a degree, but I feel like the fact that Jackie at least had more allies, even if her side was on the outs and would have lost out in that first vote, was enough to have her above Michael for me, which is why she is here at number 22. Now we're moving on to number 21, and we literally have the next boot, but here we have Anjali. And there is an element of Anjali getting screwed over here where she would have survived that first vote over Jackie. However, once Jackie is gone, and with George's alliance still being a target, she was going to be the next vote there, especially with people keeping George around as a shield. So there is that element of Anjali getting screwed over here. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think she's that good of a player. And the fact that she agrees to go along with the vote, even though she had the chance to cancel Tribal, is pretty insane there. But I also feel like some of that is because she just didn't want to play the game anymore. She didn't really have her heart in it, which is an issue. However, I do put her above Michael because, again, she had more allies in the game, and I have her above Jackie because she would have survived that first Tribal had Jackie not been medevacked. So those things were enough to have her number 21, though at the end of the day, I don't think she's that good of a player, which is why she is here at number 21. Now we're moving on to number 20, and we're literally moving on to the next boot, but here we have Mimi. And Mimi didn't do too much wrong. Now, she did obviously put her hand in the cookie jar looking for an idol, and that kind of painted a target on her back. But really, I feel like Mimi is another player that didn't really have many allies within the game, which explains why that action drives her downfall here. And I feel like she probably would have been an early boot regardless. Now, the main reason I have her above the other people is she did survive 2 tribals, and I feel like she didn't do as much actively wrong compared to the other players, but still, I don't see her as that good of a player, which is why she's here at number 20. Now we're moving on to number 19, and this is a very interesting player to talk about considering she was my winner pick going into the season. But here we have Shawnee. And Shawnee's game is very mediocre, where I feel like throughout a lot of the game, despite her coming off as a super fan, she talks so much about playing with honor and integrity that it makes me question her true game ability. And I feel like, despite her talking about that stuff in confessional, I have a great sense that she genuinely wanted to play that way, given her undying loyalty to Jerry because Jerry was basically a father figure to her. And that basically leads to her being on the outs, where she's obviously on the outs during that initial vote where Jerry is sent over to the other tribe. We even see Nina letting her know about the split vote plan, only for her to not go along with it. And really, despite her seeming to be in this position where she could reintegrate, she never really is a part of the majority alliance, where it's basically just her and Jerry for a lot of it, both of them being at the bottom, and I don't think she ever would have been in the majority moving forward unless a swap were to happen. Now, I think there are a few mitigating factors that keep Shawnee in somewhat higher contention. One is the fact that she was technically idled out of the game. I think that's at least one thing to consider. Like, Benjamin was going to go home over her. And even before that, Jerry was going to be a potential target. You also have the fact that she does technically survive 2 tribals, so that puts her above someone like a Michael or an Anjali. And I also feel like Shawnee was also seen as a bit of a bigger threat, where obviously between her and Jerry, it makes more sense to take out Shawnee simply because Jerry would have been a future target in the future. Although even then, he does flip shortly after the swap, so again, not great on Shawnee's end. I feel like there is not that much you can really praise about Shawnee's game other than building a relationship with Jerry, where she never really was included on any of the votes. And I feel like that is such a big knock to where I can't really have her any higher than this place, despite how far she technically makes in the game. But it's for all those reasons that I have her here at number 19. Now we're moving on to number 18, and this was another tough placement, as we don't really see much of this person's game on the show. However, I feel like they did less wrong compared to other people. But here we have Sarah. And Sarah is an interesting case where she does have similar issues to a Michael, where despite her trying to play a more strategic game and her trying to play the middle, she was never able to solidify any social bonds, to where coming to a round, she was technically seen as a swing vote at one point. But because she was seen as this untrustworthy figure, they decide to flip the vote against her to where she's voted out unanimously. And I think that reflects that she wasn't as well positioned as this show made her out to be. Now, at the end of the day, I feel like she doesn't do as much wrong compared to certain other people we already talked about. And plus, she does survive 3 tribals, which can't be overlooked. But I still feel like Sarah played a pretty mediocre game and not one that I can praise too much, which is why she is here number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have a player that I was pretty high on in the preseason, but I feel like they just didn't pan out as well. But here we have Benjamin. And Benjamin's a weird case as he does make it decently far considering how bad his position was for a lot of the game, where he's pretty much on the bottom for the entire pre-swap, where people don't seem to trust him that much. He makes a fake idol for whatever reason that causes people to not trust him. And he also needs to play an idol during the Shawnee round. That's not great. Although you can sort of credit him for flipping the vote onto Shawnee, who would have been a bigger threat for him in the future compared to Jerry. Although he also should have recognized that Jerry had just gone over to the other tribe after feeling like he was at the bottom. So obviously Jerry was pretty unlikely to stick with him. And then post swap, he's obviously down the numbers there. However, despite being at the bottom of that original heroes group, and despite seeming like a perfect candidate to flip over, Jerry pretty much takes up that spot of the hero on the bottom that flips to give the original villain contingent the majority, as he's never able to take that to his advantage, where he does survive the Paige vote, which makes sense given that Paige was better positioned on the original heroes tribe. But then he just doesn't really offer much to the heroes afterwards to where he's taken out next. And I feel like that's not great on his end. Really, I feel like he probably should play that swap a bit better. But really, Benjamin was someone who was on the bottom for most of the game. And there isn't that much I can really praise about him. But I still feel like he made it further than other people. And I think there's a bit more you can say right about him, like him flipping the vote during the Shawnee round, in him technically surviving that first round after the swap against Paige, but I still feel like his game was mostly mediocre, which is why he's here number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and we have a pretty problematic figure, but here we have Paige. Now, say what you will about Paige outside the game as a person. Inside the game, she didn't play that well. However, she definitely was in the majority for more of the game than a lot of the people we already talked about. Pre-swap, I wouldn't say she was super well positioned. She was in the majority, but I wouldn't say she was in that core majority group, where she was targeted during the rogue round, mainly due to the stuff outside of the game about her being a trophy hunter, but it's rogue. And she always had the numbers there to stay. After that, she is in the majority for the next few rounds. She's one of the main people vocalizing a need to take out Charly due to her supposedly throwing the challenge. And then she gets a pretty bad swap where she's mainly taken out due to her being seen as more central to the original hero contingent compared to Benjamin and Jerry. Although even then, she wasn't really in that core majority at any point. She wasn't exactly the linchpin, but obviously compared to Benjamin and Jerry, she was the least likely to flip, so she was taken out. Now, you can credit her for technically being idled out, although even then she already had the majority of the votes there, and the votes that she threw into George were negated by his idol. So I don't think Paige played that well in the grand scheme of things. I don't think she did as much actively wrong compared to other people. She just wasn't in the best position long term, to where if the heroes were to get to the merge with the numbers and that structure were to get down, I don't think Paige was set up super well beyond that point. But there is an element of her getting swap screwed, and she did technically be a part of the majority for those couple of rounds where she did go to tribal, which was enough to put her here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and this is another weird player where I'm not entirely sure what to make of their game, but I did decide to put Stevie here. Now, Stevie's a weird case where he does make it further than some players we'll be talking about in a moment, where he is the final boot before the merge, and he was technically in the majority for more of the game than a lot of players we've already talked about, where early on he is not in the best position. He is part of Simon's alliance. Although even then, I would say he was at the bottom of that alliance. And that alliance was about to lose Simon had Simon not won immunity at that crazy tribal that resulted in the plan shifting. And we even see that Stevie was going to be one of the targets at that vote, where obviously George basically tested Simon to get him to play his idol on Stevie. And then Simon pretty much admitted to Stevie that he was on the outs and that he would not play the idol on him to save him, only for that to not go through when Frazier's taken out instead, which causes Stevie to flip. And obviously, you do have to credit Stevie for flipping at that point, although the circumstances that allow Stevie to recognize that he was at the bottom are a bit wonky. But after that, he does flip, although even then, I would still say he was at the bottom of that alliance there. But that alliance is able to be part of the majority for the rest of the pre-merge. He gets a beneficial swap where he's able to stay with that group, and he's even seen as the swing vote once the heroes on that side follow the numbers. And while he does ultimately stay with the Spice Girls, it's good that he's at least seen as a swing vote. And I realize that all this makes it sound like Stevie's in this wonderful position. However, the reality is that despite him being in the majority for a lot of the game, he's not really that active in the game. And even when he's in the majority, he's always at the bottom of whatever group he's in. And I always got the sense that he was the most expendable player within that, to where obviously on Simon's group, he was seen as very expendable, to where Simon outwardly told him that he would not play his idol to save him. And then even after he joins George's alliance, he's seen as expendable, as seen during his boot round, where the reason he's targeted is a compromise from the other players, where Liz and Shawnee didn't want to take out Flick, George didn't want to take out Mad, and basically Stevie just ends up as the boot due to a compromise, where despite it being in their best interest to vote out Flick, we see George get up and talk to Jerry in the middle of tribal, and Stevie is just clueless to all this. And he's just taken out as this compromise because like the two sides didn't want to really pick a side here. So I feel like in that regard, that further cements Stevie as a pretty expendable player and not a very active one. And plus, I don't feel like he would have won the game even if he got to the end. So I feel like there's a lot of issue I take with Stevie's game, where despite him making it this far, and despite him being in the majority for a lot of the game, that I feel like he never really did that much to make his own fate. And I feel like a lot of his fate in the game was determined by other players. Now, at the end of the day, he still made it further than the other players we already talked about. And plus, he was technically within the majority for a lot more of the game, even if he wasn't in as much control. But I still feel like his lack of control within his own group, along with like his lack of win equity, was enough to leave him here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have the earliest boot left to talk about, but here we have Frazier. And I'm sure some people will think this person is too high. However, I think Frazier played an alright game for the most part, and sort of similar to Anjali, he has a major element of being screwed over, where he was part of Simon's alliance early on. He was very close to Jordy, to where he was his number 2. And plus, during that crazy tribal, he was looped in on the plan to flip against Simon. He knew that Simon was a sinking ship, and he was going to go along with the plan up until Simon won immunity, of course. And he was obviously, even after that, part of George's group that probably would have taken out Stevie as collateral damage. However, we obviously see George decide to flip the game against Frazier in order to allow Stevie to join his group afterwards. So I think Frazier did suffer a bit from being collateral damage, where obviously by taking him out, he would have weakened Jordy in the future, while obviously pulling in Stevie and overall just weakening Simon's whole power structure. However, I still think Frazier did get screwed over to a degree simply due to the circumstances that led to his boot. And plus, outside of that, I don't think he did that much wrong within the game, other than just being in this position to where he was the most logical boot for the Georges of the world. So I feel like because of that, I did have him a bit higher in the list, though considering the rest of the field, I can't really have him too much higher than 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and we're actually jumping forward a couple spots actually to a person that made the jury phase. But here we have Sam. And Sam is a weird case where he did make it decently far, of course, and he was technically part of the core majority alliance, mainly Sean's alliance. However, I always felt like he was not really a trusted member of that core, where he isn't exactly a decision maker at any point. We even hear Sean talking about not trusting him too much, to where he actively decides to not tell Sam about his idol because he doesn't feel like he can trust Stan that much, and in general, he finds Sam to be pretty naive. And to his credit, Sam is part of the majority for a lot of those early votes. However, coming to the swap, he's in a pretty weird spot where, despite him being in that majority, he was somehow the backup target for the Jordy round, where he was pretty much left out of that. And had Jordy been able to pull Simon back in, he would have basically taken out Sam in that round. So I feel like that alone is a major indictment against Sam's game. And I feel like moving forward, Sam's not really able to get back in the majority, where obviously coming to the merge, he sticks with that hero group that's in the minority, and they're pretty much just picked off until he's taken out third, mainly because I feel like he was one of the smaller threats within that group. So I feel like Sam, despite making it to the merge, I find his game pretty underwhelming for the most part, and I can't justify putting him any higher than number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have the highest ranked pre-merge boot left to talk about, but here we have Jordy. And Jordy is a very interesting game where early on he was in a very strong position where he was pretty much the center of that villains tribe, where he was obviously very close to Simon. He was basically Simon's right hand man and also the voice of reason for Simon when he was getting a bit tunnel visioned. But he also had good relationships with the Georges of the world and with the Shawnees and Liz's of the world as well. He was set up pretty well early on. And similar to Frazier, he was looped in on that plan to take out Simon, where he obviously recognized that Simon was becoming a bit of a lost cause and he was going to go along with the plan. However, once things go wrong with Simon winning immunity, he is still thinking he's part of the majority and was willing to go along with the Stevie plan. But then George basically exposes Jordy in the middle of tribal by revealing that Jordy was the one to tell everyone about Simon's idol, which obviously sows a bit of distrust with Simon. But also, George ends up outplaying Jordy by taking out Frazier, who is one of his closest allies. And really, Jordy is in a pretty awkward spot, although I wouldn't say he was going to be the next to go. After that, he gets a pretty terrible swap where he's basically on the bottom along with Liz, and it seemed like he was going to be the next boot. However, he had a good enough relationship with Shawnee to where Shawnee decides to give him her idol, and mixing that with Liz also having an idol, that basically made it so that both him and Liz were in an interesting spot coming to this vote, where they obviously tell the other group about their idols and that they try to use this to flip over Nina and Haley. And there was a very real chance that they could have won out this vote simply using their idols. However, we obviously know what happens, where Jordy gets a bit too greedy by not actually playing his idol, and the hero contingent calls his bluff. They throw their votes onto Jordy, causing a tie, which in turn basically makes him a goner at that point. And I know people will dunk on him for not playing his idol in that spot and for basically being too greedy. However, the fact that he was in that position to where he literally had Nina and Haley on his side through this play is still pretty impressive. And to be fair, had he managed to hold on to both of the idols and got through that round, he would have been in a very strong position moving forward. The only issue is that he wasn't able to hold on to Simon, who was obviously very much willing to flip over to the heroes at that point. So I still think Jordy deserves a lot of credit for his game here. And yes, while it does get bumpy towards the back half, I still think there are enough pros with this game and enough potential upside had that last vote worked out to where I decided to put him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and from this point on the list, everyone left made the merge, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But at number 11, and I did debate these next couple of ones, however, number 11, I decided to go with Flick. And I think Flick played an alright game for the most part. She was in the majority for a decent amount of the original Heroes tribe, although I wouldn't say she was necessarily in the core of that per se. However, she is shown talking to Sean about getting them to keep Haley around as a shield, And I think her having this relationship with Haley is another boon to her game. But obviously, she gets a pretty bad swap where she's down the numbers. And you do have to give her credit. She does survive through the Paige round, despite Flick being a more integral piece of the hero's power structure compared to Paige. And she also survives the Benjamin round, which I think you can also give her a lot of credit for. And even beyond that, she's able to build a good enough relationship with Shawnee and Liz to where they want to keep her during that last round before the merge, despite George recognizing that she would have flipped right back to the heroes at the merge. But she's able to go so far as to allow Shawnee and Liz to fight for her and to get George to compromise to cut one of his own numbers in Stevie as a compromise. So I think that alone is a pretty impressive element of gameplay from her. The problem is that once she flips over at the merge, she's immediately down the numbers where David goes first and she's the next to go. So I think on the whole, Flick does have elements of good gameplay. Now at the end of the day, she was down the numbers at the merge that she wasn't really able to recover from. Even before that, her swap, while that demonstrated good gameplay, she wasn't necessarily in the most control for a lot of that. And it really wasn't until that last round where she had at least some control. So because of that, I can't have her too much higher than here. And plus, she was a very early merge boot, so I can't have her too much higher than number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we actually have the merge boot of the season, but here we have David. And it's really strange because, on one hand, David was barely on this show, and I joked about that over and over again on the power rankings, where I consistently had him at the bottom due to him not getting any confessionals, only having one confessional across the entire season despite him being a merge boot. However, if we are looking at the actual game from the footage that we saw, David actually played a pretty good game where he was essentially in the majority for the entire pre-merge, where early on he was a core member of the Sean's Alliance. And yes, while Sean is shown not telling him about his idol, we also see David talking quite a bit of strategy, and he seemed to be one of the more strategic players within that alliance. Post swap, he's still in a good position where he's still part of that core group. However, he's also able to build a side alliance with Nina, Sam, and Liz that could have given him more options in the future. Now, obviously, that group falls apart after Liz mutinies. However, I think it shows that David was pretty proactive in the game and had a number of connections. And at the merge, while he is the merge boot, I think a lot of that was because he was one of the bigger threats on the board, not just from a physical standpoint, but also from a strategic standpoint, where he had all these connections. And I feel like he was a more integral piece within that group at that point compared to the likes of Sean or Sam that could have weakened that group in the future. And sure enough, it does. So it's really funny that despite David consistently being at the bottom of my power rankings, which was based purely off the edit, I think when we're assessing his gameplay, he has to be quite a bit higher on this list, as I feel like the limited content that we did see of him highlighted that he was in a strong position for a lot of the game and that he was a very capable player. Now, obviously, you can question why he was so purpled in the edit, but that's Australian Survivor for you. But I feel like with the evidence that I have, I feel pretty confident putting him at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and I'm actually surprised by how high this person ended up being, which is funny considering how deep in the game they made it. However, they have one major pro going for them. But here we have Simon, and Simon played a very rocky game, obviously. And he obviously relied quite a bit on immunity to get as far as he did. And there's not too much to praise about his game, outside of the fact that he was the biggest jury threat by the end of the season, which is a bit surprising considering how he came off on the show. But if the jury villa videos and the exit interviews are to be believed, he would have been pretty likely to win had he gotten to the end, which is pretty shocking. But obviously his game was incredibly flawed, where early on he was in an okay spot where he was able to build a solid group of him, Jordy, Frazier, and Stevie that was able to get through some of those early rounds. However, it wasn't long before he started to paint a target on his back due to him wanting to be the one to target George, which wasn't entirely unwarranted, and especially after seeing how well George ended up doing on this season, it made sense why he would want to target George. But obviously he wasn't able to get people on his side, and he really does start to turn Jordy and Frazier against him, where Jordy starts to see him as a sinking ship, and he starts telling people about his idol, and by the time of the craziest tribal ever, Jordy and Frazier essentially flipped to the George and Spice Girls side, to where Simon was about to be blindsided until they had that twist where they decided to have an individual immunity challenge, which Simon won. So right there you can see that Simon was essentially saved by a twist, But even at that same tribal, he gets outplayed by George, where George essentially tests him and gets him to admit that he wouldn't use his idol to save Stevie, which to be fair was probably the right call by Simon, given it didn't make sense for him to burn what he felt like was a real idol on Stevie. But obviously, George is able to use this to save Stevie and in turn flip Stevie against Simon. And really, from that point, Simon is essentially at the bottom, probably would have been voted out had they gone to another tribal. But then they get swapped, and obviously, the villains are down the numbers. However, we see Simon work very hard to build inroads with the hero majority, and while he's somewhat effective in doing so, it's pretty clear that he's at the bottom of that new group. And obviously, when they go to tribal, he is considered a swing vote between the heroes and the villains. And obviously, he sides with the heroes, which causes that tie that causes Jordy to get cut. But even after that, Simon is still at the bottom of this group, where we see the heroes trying to get Simon to hand over his idol. And yes, while Simon's able to negotiate, he still gives away the idol, which is pretty bad. And it further blows up in his face when we see Benjamin playing it unsuccessfully, getting cut there, and then the heroes get mad at Simon for thinking that he got one up on them when he didn't intend to do so. But still, it's pretty bad that he's at the bottom. At the merge, he is in the majority to a degree where he is voting with the villains. However, even then, he is still not in that core group. But then at the SAM round, he flips to join the heroes and trying to flip the game against George, but is unsuccessful in doing so. And really, from the SAM round on, he never votes correctly again, where during the SAM round, he votes for George. During the Shawnee round, he's completely let out of those plans, throws his vote onto Sean. During the Sean round, despite him being one of the two main targets at that tribal, he votes for Matt. During the Haley round, he votes for George, but that doesn't work. And then really, the next time he votes correctly is during the non-elimination round, where he votes for Nina to be sent to the exile place. But really, that was a unanimous vote anyway, so nothing special there. And at the final six, while he does try to flip Nina in order to blindside George, they're unable to get Jerry on their side, and in turn that causes a tie where obviously Simon goes home in the revote. And I haven't even mentioned the fact that he won 3 immunities during the stretch, all of which he probably needed, and he probably would have been voted out at any of those tribals had he not had immunity. So I feel like Simon played a very rocky game where, despite him having control during a couple of rounds, there are many stretches in the game where he was out of control, and even in the rounds where he probably should have been a swing vote, he is just left out of the plans here. However, I think the one major pro going for him is the fact that he was this big jury threat, or at least based on what we heard from exit interviews and the Juryville videos, where despite him coming off as a bit of a doofus, he was well liked by a lot of the players in the game, particularly those that made the jury. And I feel like had he gotten to the end, he probably would have gotten some favor there to potentially win the game. Now, granted, he would have needed to win out, as I don't see anyone actually taking him to the end. However, I think the fact that he had this much win equity, despite him not being in that much control, is a boon to his game, and something that is keeping him a bit higher in this list than he probably would be otherwise. So I feel like at the end of the day, Simon is someone that probably wins the game had he gotten to the end, and plus he was someone that was at least a bit more active in the game and tried to flip things against George. The only problem was that he was largely ineffective in those things. So I feel like mixing that with his immunity streak and all the points in which he could have gone home before when he went home were enough to bump him down to number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and this player is pretty similar to Simon in that they made it very deep into the game despite there being some bums. However, I feel like this person was at least in the majority for more of the game than Simon. But here we have Jerry. And realistically, Jerry's game is probably less impressive in terms of win equity, where obviously Jerry loses at the end, and I don't really see how he wins a jury vote. However, like I said, I think Jerry was in the majority for more of the game. Now, granted, his beginning game was pretty rough, where I think he benefits greatly from being on the Heroes tribe, which was the more dominant tribe in challenges, and also having Rogue as a very easy first boot, but obviously he was at the bottom, given he was, again, the oldest player on the season, and also had an injured foot, which made him a challenge liability. Now, yes, he did build a very close bond with Shawnee. However, even then they were at the bottom, and while they got to the Rogue round all right, by that next round, they essentially agreed to vote out Jerry as sort of a mercy kill until it was a non-elimination round and Jerry was sent over to the other tribe. So in that sense, Jerry was saved by a twist. However, once he goes over to the villains for a round, he does the correct thing. He builds inroads with them and is able to bond with the George, Shawnee, and Liz group to where they essentially agree to work together in the future. And then he does agree to go back to the Heroes tribe, which was a smart move as it obviously hides that connection. And yes, immediately afterwards, he does basically admit to the tribe that he's at the bottom, which is a bit questionable, but he's able to avoid the target there. However, at the next tribal, he loses Shawnee, his closest ally, despite him being the initial target, which again is another pretty big knock. But then he gets a pretty beneficial swap where he's able to join the Georges and Shawnees, the people he had connected with the most on the villains tribe. And from that point on, he's essentially in the majority the rest of the game. Now, with that comes some issues with how active he was within that and whether he made the correct moves. Like, I think the Paige and Benjamin rounds were alright, but I think the Stevie round is probably the worst move for him, where he does agree to vote out Stevie, which, yes, was promulgated by Shawnee and Liz being so willing to fight for Flick. But I think getting rid of Stevie here was particularly bad for Jerry, as Stevie was one of the few people that Jerry could possibly beat in a jury vote at the end. And I think that's one of the biggest issues with Jerry's game, where despite him being in the majority and despite him taking credit for flipping against the heroes after being at the bottom, he really doesn't have much win equity, where from the merge on, I can't really think of anyone he possibly beats at the end. I think the closest is probably a final three of him, Sam, and Matt, I think. But I think even then he probably loses that as well. So really, I think Jerry has a very hard time winning at the end. And I think the fact that he was so loyal to George for so much of the game is another big issue, to where it made it seem more like a follower for a lot of it. So really, I think Jerry is someone who was definitely in the majority for more of the game than Simon, and he still had the amount of foresight to flip against the heroes after he knew he was at the bottom. But even within that, he needed a twist in order to stay in the game at that point. And I think had the heroes gone to more tribals in the pre-merge, he probably doesn't even get that chance to flip. And even beyond that, he doesn't really do much after the merge, where he pretty much just follows George and Matt from that point on, to where by the end, he essentially doesn't have any shot of winning. So at the end of the day, I think Jerry is someone that definitely knew what to do and definitely had the ability to vote in the majority. It's just that he wasn't able to garner much respect along the way, which is why he is here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have a player that I'm pretty conflicted on, and really these next two were relatively close as well. However, I decided to go with Haley here, and the main reason I did is I don't think Haley had that much control in the game, really at all. Now, she was in the majority for most of the game. However, I feel like within that, she was definitely towards the bottom, and I feel like, especially during the pre-merge, she was mainly kept around as a shield, where early on, she was a prime target there due to her being a former winner, and the fact that on Australian Survivor, no former winner had ever survived a single tribal after coming back there. So she definitely had some pressure coming in, and there was even talk about cutting her very soon, except for the fact that she was a perfect shield for them. Now she does throw the challenge to get rid of Rogue, which was a bit questionable on her end, especially with this concern of her wanting to survive a tribal, where yes, it was Rogue, but it was also Rogue. Like, this could have happened at any time, and I feel like the main reason she threw this challenge was to get this monkey off her back of surviving a tribal, even if it was against Rogue of all people. But even beyond that, she's able to stay in the majority, and I do have to give her some credit for building bonds with the Shawns of the world to where they were willing to keep her around as a shield. But I feel like for a lot of the game, she was just that, a shield. And I feel like had they gone to more tribals, she would have eventually been cut. But she isn't, and she's able to stay in the majority there. After the swap, she is still seen as part of this group, but I still feel like she wasn't within the core of that, and I still feel like the others would have been willing to cut her at some point. And I think the biggest indication of this is when Nina decides to build a side alliance with her, Sam, Liz, and David, and they decided to take a shot at Sean's power structure by targeting Haley, which I always found to be a weird decision, as I felt like Haley was never really that big of a part of Sean's group. And considering that Nina seemed to have a better relationship with Haley, the fact that Nina was willing to cut her at that opportunity was still pretty suboptimal there. Now, you also have to mention the fact that Haley and Nina were one of the people that Jordy and Liz had approached when they had idols to try to flip the game there, And to their credit, they were willing to do that up until Jordy didn't play his idol, at which point they were forced to flip back to vote out Jordy instead. So I feel like that's another thing worth highlighting. And then we get to the merge where she does flip to the villains, mainly due to her pregame relationship with George, which is something at least. But she's able to flip there and is able to stay in the majority for a lot of this post merge where she does pick off her old heroes one after the other and is even part of the Shawnee plan as well. Now, she does eventually get caught trying to flip the game against George when she decides to vote out Sean and claim credit for that when George wanted to vote out Simon instead, which is strange considering that George also voted for Shawn at that tribal, so it's a little weird, but she does get called out for that and is eventually targeted as a result, where she's voted out in a 4-1-1-1 vote. So I feel like it's pretty impressive that Haley was able to get all the way to the final 7, despite her being a former winner and despite no former winner ever even surviving a tribal. The fact that she was able to make it that far into the game is pretty impressive. And I think had she gone to the end, she would have at least had some respect for getting to the end as a former winner. Now, whether she wins is another question, as I'm not entirely sure whether she had the true relationships there, as again, I feel like within the hero structure that she was in for a lot of that pre-merge, she was never really that well positioned, and I always felt like she would have been cut towards the end of that pre-merge had they gotten the chance to do so, but they just didn't. And even beyond that, there are some suboptimal moves, like again, her throwing the challenge to take out Rogue was pretty unnecessary. You have the fact that she was the target of Nina when they built that side alliance, and obviously, she decides to weaken George by voting out Sean, but then gets blamed for it as a result. So I still feel like there are enough holes with Haley's game, plus the fact that I don't think she was in that solid of a position for a lot of it, that leaves her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have a pretty interesting player to discuss, but here we have Shawn. And Sean's an interesting case, as I feel like he did completely dominate the pre-merge. However, he just lost the numbers after the merge and wasn't really able to recover from there. And that's obviously a pretty tough game to assess, but I still find it somewhat impressive that he had a lot of control during the pre-merge, where obviously during that pre-merge, he basically built the majority alliance of him, David, Sam, and Matt. They were able to control them. Also pulled in Flick and Haley, and obviously kept Haley around as a meat shield for a lot of it. And I feel like he controls a lot of those early votes, particularly the Rogue vote, the initial Jerry vote to send him to the other tribe, and then post swap, he's able to, again, stay in the majority there. He's able to technically pull in Simon, although Simon was also courting them, and they're able to hold the numbers even after Jordy pulls that whole ploy with the idols. They're able to stand their ground there, has Sam as the backup target in case an idol is actually played, but obviously they get through that vote all right. After that, he gets Simon to hand over his idol, which he then hands over to the heroes on the other tribe who are in the minority, but obviously it's a fake idol, and through that they lose Benjamin. And yes, while we see Nina build that side alliance to try and counter him, I always find it interesting that she would have targeted Haley first over Sean, despite Sean being the pretty clear leader of that, which I think highlights the value of keeping Haley around as a shield. But then we get to the merge where basically he loses the numbers. Now, granted, I think Simon flipping back makes a lot of sense there, and same thing with Haley given their pregame relationship. However, I always find it weird that he wasn't able to flip over Matt as well, considering that Matt was part of his alliance, and I do think that's a pretty big knock against this game. But through that, they basically fall into the minority, and from that point on, they're not able to recover. Now, granted, he did have an opportunity to idol out George in the tribal where Sam goes home, where Sam literally tells him to play the idol on Sam, but obviously he decides to play it on himself, which is technically a misread, although it's understandable why Sean did it, as he thought coming in that the vote was being split between him and Nina, and obviously when Nina played her idol, it made sense for Sean to play his idol on himself, but still, it was a misread that caused Sam to go home, wastes his idol, and obviously he does fall into the numbers again. However, something I will give Sean is that despite him being the clear leader of this alliance, he is one of the last few members standing, despite him not winning immunity at any point. And even in the round where he goes home, we see that George technically wanted to keep Sean and to take out Simon instead, but they were simply splitting the vote. And while they, along with Haley, do flip against him in that round, I think the fact that George was at least considering keeping Shawn at that point is a pro for him. And considering that he was one of the more physical people on the tribe, he is someone that could have possibly won out from that point had he stayed, but obviously it wasn't meant to be. So I think all things considered, I think Shawn played a pretty good game, all things considered. Now, yes, you can fault certain aspects of the way he treated people on the outs during the pre-merge, people like a Simon, people like a Matt, to where they obviously flipped and never went back after the merge. And obviously, you could also point out that because he was on the more dominant tribe throughout the pre-merge, that he didn't have the chance to get rid of people that could have been a trouble for him later on, like a Haley, who obviously also flips back as well. But still, the fact that he was able to survive all those rounds despite him being the leader of this alliance and also having some opportunities to flip the game in his favor were enough to land him here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this is another player that I really debated on. However, I think it's mainly longevity that's keeping them this high. But here we have Matt, the other runner-up from this season. And admittedly, I don't think Matt's game was as dominant as someone like a Sean's, and I think there were more rocky points along the way. However, I still think he was active enough to get towards the end of the game, where early on he was, again, in the majority group along with Sean, Sam, and David. However, I would say he was probably the fourth within that, and as I feel like he wasn't in the driver's seat per se, but still he was part of those early votes. He then gets a pretty bad swap where he is down the numbers with Paige and Benjamin, and he does survive a lot of those votes. He gets through the Paige round, even though he tries to get out George until George plays his idol. And then he is also trying to flip the game against Jerry until they hold the numbers there and take out Benjamin. And then he is in danger in coming to the next tribal where Shawnee and Liz choose Flick over him, and they really wanted George and Jerry to flip the game against Matt. Now, granted, they're able to change the plan at Tribal to take out Stevie instead, which I do think is good on Matt's end that he was showing enough willingness to work with George to where George wanted to keep him, but still, he wasn't technically part of that plan. And then moving forward at the merge, he is essentially one of the swing votes there. He can choose between the George side versus going back to his original alliance, and he does ultimately choose the villains. Now, you can make or leave with this decision. I personally think it was the better decision for him, as by sticking with the villains, he is sticking with bigger shields. Like, he has George, who is obviously a massive shield, but obviously Shawnee is also a pretty big shield as well. And compared to people like a Sean or a Sam or even a David, I think Matt would have had a better shot of winning immunity in the end game had he gone with the villains versus going with them. So he does make that decision there, and from that point on, he's essentially in the majority where he is part of the votes there. Now, granted, he is a target at a couple of those tribals, particularly the Flick round, but they're able to get through that all right. And plus, he does win some immunities along the way. However, I do feel like along with that comes with a harmed jury perception where even though it makes sense for him to flip, I don't feel like the heroes that he flips really recognize that to the point where by the time he gets to the end, they see him as George's follower more than anything else. And I think that really harms his jury perception to where I don't think he wins in many scenarios. I think the only way he wins the game is if he's in a final two against Jerry, which obviously wasn't happening this season. But still, he's able to get towards the end of the game. He does express a willingness to flip against George. However, he's ineffective in doing so. And really, by the end, he does ultimately do so at the final four. But by then, it's too late, as it's either him or Liz getting to the end and both of them beat him. So I think Matt didn't exactly set up his end game well, and I feel like he probably decided too late to flip, but I still recognize that he made the right decision to side with this group at the merge, and he did show a bit more active gameplay in terms of playing from the bottom. It's just that I feel like he didn't really do as much in the merge to really put a move on his resume, and when he did, it was just too late in the game. So I feel like because of that, I can't have Matt too much higher than here. But I think it's the fact that he was playing a bit more actively, plus the fact that he was in the majority and did get towards the end of the game, that leaves him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I really debated these next two as I feel like they're relatively close. However, I did decide to go with the earlier boot compared to the two. So number 4, I do have Shawnee, who I think played a very solid game for the most part, where she, similar to Sean, pretty much dominated her pre-merge tribe, where early on she was essentially the center of the villain's tribe, builds that alliance with George, recognizes that George can be used as a shield, and basically aligns with him. After the swap, she's still in a good position, although she also recognizes that Liz is in a bad position and was initially willing to give her idol to Liz, but then decides to give the idol to Jordy instead. And we obviously see that Jordy is almost able to flip the game there until he messes it up, overplays, and obviously gets taken out there. But even beyond that, she's still in a good position where she's with George and Jerry, who they had flipped over during his time on the Villains Tribe. They're able to pick off the heroes that are in the minority. They're able to reunite with Liz after Liz mutinies over to their tribe. However, we then get to what I think is the biggest flaw with Shawnee's game, where she builds this very good relationship with Flick to the point where her and Liz are willing to fight to keep Flick at that last round before the merge. And obviously, this is a mistake where George points out to her that Flick would have flipped back to the heroes at the merge, which is ultimately correct. But yet, Shawnee just digs her heels in on this vote to the point where her and Liz were willing to play an idol to keep Flick in that round. And through that, George is basically forced to compromise and vote out Stevie instead, who in turn was a number for their alliance. Now, granted, Stevie did say before that he probably wanted revenge on Shawnee, but obviously they had already built in a relationship with Stevie after they got saved at the craziest tribal. So I still feel like this was a mistake on Shawnee's end that they're willing to cut Stevie, one of their own numbers, over Flick, someone who was obviously in a good position with the other side. Now, granted, none of that matters, as despite Flick flipping over, they're able to pull in Simon and Matt to where they're able to hold the numbers anyway. But still, I think this was a suboptimal move on Shawnee's end. They're able to stay in the numbers the next couple of rounds until the final 9, where George recognizes that Shawnee and Liz are closer to each other than they are to him, which causes him to blindside Shawnee with an idol in her pocket. Now, obviously with that comes the flaw of Shawnee keeping George in the game too long, where she said that she was planning to cut him at the final 8. However, I feel like this was definitely a bit too deep in the game to keep George around. I feel like realistically, she probably should have tried to cut him a bit closer to the merge, like probably post swap, but I also understand why she decided to keep George around. But obviously, with that extra time, George was able to build his own numbers, build his own game to where he was eventually able to outgrow his role as just Shawnee's shield and become a force in his own right to where he outplays Shawnee by the end of it. So I think that's a flaw on her end. So like I feel like between that and obviously the whole Flick situation, it's still a knock against her game. But I still find Shawnee's game very impressive, where I feel like had she survived that round, I feel like she would have been set up pretty well to get towards the end of the game, where if she cuts George at 8, she still has some shields that could allow her to get towards the end of the game and obviously win if she were to get to the end. But it's obviously the fact that she was cut at the final 9, which is pretty far from the end of the game, but still an impressive enough gain to where she's here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and I understand that people may have this person below Shawnee. However, I feel like the fact that this person made it a couple rounds deeper into the game and was at least closer to winning the game was enough to have them here. But here we have Nina. And Nina is a weird game to assess as well, where I feel like in my talk of her game during my power rankings, I felt like I was a bit more critical of her game, particularly with some of her targets in the pre-merge. And while I still have those complaints, I don't detract them as much from her game as I probably would have before, especially considering how far she ends up making it. But if we're talking about her game, I feel like early on she was in the majority group. Granted, not in the core of it, but still well positioned within it, where she had some solid relationships there, is able to get through a lot of those early rounds. I do question her decision to flip the vote against Shawnee during that round, where she does tell Shawnee about this plan to split the vote. However, rather than using that as a way to pull in Shawnee and Jerry, she just decides to target Shawnee there, which I think is pretty suboptimal there. But I also understand why she didn't want to take that risk so early on. Post swap, she's still in a good position where she is approached by Jordy and Liz to flip the game against the Sams of the world after they reveal their idols. And while she does initially go along with it, she does flip back again, sort of similar to Haley. But then afterwards, she is shown building this side alliance with her, Liz, Sam, and David. However, within that, she decides to target Haley for whatever reason, which I do question as well, where despite Haley being a part of Sean's alliance, she is also obviously one of the less powerful people within that alliance. So I do question that decision, but That group never goes to tribals, so whatever. And then post-merge, she is down the numbers as well. Again, loses some of those allies there. However, she's still able to build some inroads to where by the final 9, she is pulled into the Shawnee blindside, which I find pretty impressive. The next round, she's able to, again, continue to build those inroads to where eventually she's able to build an alliance with George and Liz. This Jacuzzi alliance is able to allow her to be in the numbers there. Now, granted, at the final 6, she is technically on the outs where she is voted out, but obviously that's a non-elimination round. And then beyond that, she's able to be part of the group to take out Simon. Now, granted, she was part of the tie, but they're able to prevail there. And at the final 5, she was in a somewhat interesting spot where she could have carried the numbers there. Now, granted, George recognized that she was a bigger threat compared to Matt, so she gets taken out. However, she did get to the final 5 and was able to build some inroads, unlike a lot of the other heroes, to where she was eventually able to get to that spot. And I think had she gone to the end, she could have won. Now, I do question how much respect she truly had from a lot of the heroes, but I think the fact that she was able to maneuver well from within the bottom is an impressive element to her game, and I do appreciate that. And plus, I think she was a bit more effective in her plans compared to a Simon. So I think those are all things that elevate Nina's game to be this high on the list. But obviously, there's a very clear top 2, which is why Nina is here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and obviously the top 2 is Liz and George, and really it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 2, I did decide to go with the winner of the season, but here we have Liz. And really, I think this decision can be compared to my decision from Survivor 43 on that player ranking, where I feel like Liz and George sort of occupy similar roles, where obviously Liz is the winner of the season and the player that I think probably had a clearer path for more of the game and was less likely to be a target, but ultimately did not play as actively for a lot of it compared to George, who did more or less dominate the game, but couldn't win a challenge to save his life. And there are parallels to be made with Survivor 43, where I think Liz is like Gabler, who had a clearer path to the end, but maybe didn't play as out in front, whereas George is more like the Jesse, who was more out in front and dominated more of the game, but couldn't win a challenge to save his life. And I remember on my 43 player ranking that I put Gabler over Jesse because Gabler had a clearer path to the end. And I had a similar debate with this list. However, for this time, I did decide to put the more dominant and active player over the actual winner of the season. Now, that's not to say Liz didn't play a good game. I think she played a pretty good game where she was in the majority early on. She was part of the majority alliance. However, I feel like she was the second in command to Shawnee for a lot of it, where she wasn't really the one making the decisions for that group. It was more so Shawnee making a lot of those calls. But even though she was in the majority for a lot of those early rounds, she obviously gets a pretty bad swap where she is down the numbers. And you do have to give her credit for surviving that Jordy round, where Jordy was seen as the bigger target over her. But still, like, they had that whole ploy where they had idols. Liz had her idol, Jordy had one handed to him from Shawnee. They were planning to use that pressure in order to flip Nina and Haley over, and they were largely effective in doing so up until Jordy didn't play his idol, which caused a tie, and in turn, Jordy was a goner. And obviously from that point, Liz was still at the bottom. However, she built good enough relationships with Nina to where she was eventually included in that side alliance with Nina, Sam, and David. And with Simon burning a lot of the heroes through the fake idol, they were going to target Simon next over Liz. However, even then, Liz is given the chance to mutiny, which she ultimately does, to be reunited with her allies. And obviously, at the next round, we have the whole Flick situation, where Shawnee and Liz decide that they want to keep Flick around, not realizing that Flick was more likely to flip back to the heroes at the merge. And this is a knock against Liz's game, same thing with Shawnee. Only Liz had an idol that she was actively willing to use in order to save Flick, which forced George and Jerry's hand, and in turn, Stevie is a target there. But obviously, that was a suboptimal move, as the very next round, Flick flipped over at the merge. However, even then they're able to get the numbers, and in turn, flip the game against David, and from that point on, they're in the majority. Again, they're in the majority for a lot of those early rounds, but again, I still feel like Liz is more so in the background, while Shawnee and George are the ones calling the shots. But then we get to the final 9 where George recognizes that Shawnee and Liz are closer to each other than they are to him, which prompts him to pull off the Shawnee blindside, where obviously Liz is completely left out of that. That's a pretty bad look there. But I think after that she recovers pretty nicely, where she recognizes that while George burned her, that it's better to keep George as a shield to make him think that she's loyal to him, only to cut him towards the very end, and to just take out these other bigger threats as they come up, even if they're necessarily targeting George. So she has a hand in taking out Haley at the final 7, Simon at the final 6, and she also is able to build an alliance with Nina to form this Jacuzzi alliance. But then we get to the final 5 where she did want to stick with that group in order to take out Matt and obviously improve her position. But then again, George is able to outplay her there by sticking with Jerry and Matt to take out Nina, which sets her up pretty poorly for the final 4, where had this season ended with a final 2, she would have absolutely needed that final 4 immunity, or else she would have been a goner, as I believe that George, Matt, and Jerry were a tight trio. However, with this season ending with a final 3 and there only being one more opportunity to cut George, I think that would have offered her a bit more leverage to convince the Matts and Jerrys to cut George at that round, even if she didn't win immunity there. Now, obviously, she wins immunity anyway, which makes it so that George was pretty much a goner at that point, but I still feel like she wasn't set at the best for that very end game. So I think there's certainly merits to Liz winning game here, where she was in the majority for a lot of it, although even then she was a second in command to Shawnee. And I think afterwards, there are definitely pros to her game, like keeping around George as a shield and just maintaining a good enough relationship with George to allow him to keep her over the likes of Simon or Haley, people that would have tried to flip the game against her sooner. I think Liz recognized that she herself needed George to be in the end game to better increase her odds of getting towards the end of the game, as I don't think she would have gotten towards the end of the game had George been cut around the final 7 or final 6. But with that said, I still think George outplayed her by the end of it, where she was able to lose her ally in Nina at the final 5, which made it so that she was basically down 3-1 at that final 4 round. And at that point, she pretty much needed to rely on her physical presence in order to win those challenges over George and put the pressure onto Matt and Jerry to cut George, which she was pretty effective in doing so. However, I still think George ultimately outplayed her at the end, which is why I do have her here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the player I believe played the best game on Australian Survivor Heroes vs. Villains is George. Now, that's not to say that George doesn't have holes within his game, and we'll get into those in a moment, but I still feel like compared to the rest of the field, he played the most dominant game on the season. And considering the target that he had on his back, considering the game that he played on Brains versus Brawn, the fact that he got all the way to the final 4 while playing the game that he did is extremely impressive. And I think at this point, George will be in the conversation as being one of the best Australian Survivor players. Now, if we're looking at his game, obviously early on it's not great. His alliance is down the numbers with Anjali and Jackie. He loses both of those allies back to back, one due to a medevac, the other due to the first tribal. And from that point on, he is being kept around as a shield source, similar to Haley, where obviously Michael wanted to take the shot at him early on. Same thing with Simon, but he's mainly kept in because of his relationship with Shawnee, who recognized that he could be used as his shield, and he's able to ride that pretty well. And then we get to the craziest tribal ever, where despite Simon's alliance ready to take the shot at him, they're able to pull in Jordy and Frazier to where they were about to blindside Simon up until Simon won immunity. And then we see George turn this around into this very interesting tribal where, one, he's able to expose Jordy for playing the middle and for throwing Simon under the bus by exposing the fact that he had an idol. He's then able to test Simon and get Simon to admit that he wouldn't use his idol to save Stevie, which in turn earns Stevie's loyalty. And he's able to flip the vote onto Frazier, which weakens Jordy's position in the future, while also ensuring that Stevie stays in the game and can be a number for him. So he's able to accomplish several things at once that are pretty effective stuff. Now, granted, he did also need his idol in that case, since he did get 2 votes against him, But still, the fact that he's able to come out on top of this tribal is pretty impressive, even if it did raise his threat level. He then gets a pretty decent swap where he's able to remain with his allies, but also pick up Jerry, who he was able to build a good relationship with during his time on the Villains tribe. And they're able to control those next couple of votes where they are able to pick off Paige and Benjamin, these players from the Heroes tribe. But at the same time, they're able to rope in Matt as well, who, despite being part of the majority on the original Heroes tribe, decides to not only flip to George's alliance in the short term on the SWAT tribe, but they're also able to remain with the Spice Girls in the post merge as well, which is pretty insane. Now, I think one knock you can point to is the Stevie tribal, where he's unable to convince Shawnee and Liz that Flick was going to flip back at the merge. I think that's not ideal. However, he's able to quickly flip the vote around to take out Stevie, which you could give or take, where I think Stevie would have been more loyal to George and Jerry in the long term compared to Matt. However, the fact that he was able to come up with this plan on the fly and execute it pretty well is also indicative of him being a good player. But it doesn't matter because at the merge, despite Flick flipping over, they're able to pull in all these numbers. And also Haley, who he had a pregame relationship with, and also someone that was willing to share information with him during the challenges in the pre-merge. And through that, they're able to create this new majority alliance that are able to flip the game on the original heroes, and he's able to pick them off one at a time. But along the way, continue to make moves such as the final 9, where he recognizes that Shawnee and Liz were closer to each other than they were to him, which causes him to pull out the Shawnee blindside, taking her out in a 5 to 3 to 1 vote with an idol in her pocket. The very next round, he's able to pull off this vote split plan between Sean and Simon, where the show presents it as him wanting Simon out over Sean. However, he does technically vote for Sean in this tribal, but obviously Haley does as well, causing Sean to go out. The very next round, we see Haley trying to flip the game against him, but obviously he's able to take one out over her. And then he's also able to build this alliance with Liz and Nina, which sets him up pretty well to where he is in 2 alliances. He is in one with Jerry and Matt, but also in an alliance with Nina and Liz, which is pretty good there. And obviously at the next round, he's able to take out Simon, who was a pretty big threat to him. Next round after that, he's able to weaken Liz by taking out Nina. And I think in this stretch, he really highlights a lot of control throughout the game. Now, with that comes some issues. I think for one, his jury management is a bit questionable, where I think the way he treats a lot of the former heroes on their way out is not ideal, to where we see during the exit interviews and Jury Villa videos that they're not necessarily happy with George and the way that he's running the game. They talk about how George has a less than ideal social game, and even Shawnee, someone that worked with George for a lot of the game, also wasn't that enthusiastic about George on her way out as well, to where Simon was seen as a jury favorite, which I think again highlights that George didn't have the best jury management in the world. Now, yes, he does take out Simon, and he even advocates for removing him from the jury. However, I also think it makes it so that George isn't guaranteed to win in every scenario. Now, granted, by the final 5, I'm pretty confident that he beats everyone left in the game if he were to get to the end. However, that leads into the other problem that he doesn't have a very clear path to the very end, where despite him positioning himself pretty well earlier on in the game, it's hard to imagine having many people that actually wanted to take him to the end, where even his closest ally in Jerry was probably more likely to take Matt to the end had it been a final 2. And then obviously Liz was someone who was biding her time by that point, where she was dragging George along because George benefited her game more than anyone else's. But by the final 4, he was in a spot to where he basically needed to win final immunity to at least ensure a spot in the end. Now, there are questions over what would have happened had Matt won final immunity, as there could have been this push to take out Liz at that point. However, I think they also recognized that George was a much bigger jury threat compared to Liz, and I feel like with Liz winning final immunity, that pretty much sealed George's fate at that point. So I think there are issues with positioning at the very end in terms of just how big of a threat he was, which, to be fair, was promulgated by himself as well, given all the big and flashy moves that he's making, not to mention just how big of a personality he is. However, I think at the end of the day, George played by far the most dominant game on this season. I still find it very impressive how, despite him being so out in front and despite so many people wanting to target him, that he was able to have so many numbers on his side for a lot of the game. Now, I think earlier on, some of that was because he was a shield, But I think the fact that he was able to retain so much control later on in the game indicates that he was able to outgrow his position as a shield, which I think really summarizes his game. And I feel like had he won this season, that he would be seen as a top tier winner. Now, yes, there are flaws. I think his jury management is not ideal. I don't think it's guaranteed that he wins every single final three scenario. And plus, he is a big threat at the very end as well as the very beginning of the game. There are multiple points where people want to flip the game against him, which I think is a problem in its own right. And plus, he can't win a challenge to save his life, which is a problem when you are a big threat at the very end. But I still feel like George has by far the most pros to his game, which is why I have him here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, it really helps out with the channel. Now, I will be wrapping up my coverage with a review of the season where I give my personal thoughts on it, so stay tuned for that. I'm currently covering Survivor 44 and providing weekly power rankings for that, so stay tuned for that as well. Same thing with Big Brother Canada 11, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.